Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I read you a book. We are, gradually, reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. And this is the story of a little war that breaks out in a sleepy cathedral town in England in the 19th century. Which doesn't sound very promising if you haven't ever read Trollope, but believe me, you will fall under his spell. When his powers are well marshaled and he knows exactly what he's about, you will fall under his spell, and that is all true for Barchester Towers. I would argue, and a lot of his fans at the time that this was coming out in serialized form would have argued that this was the very first time that all of his powers were completely at their peak and under his control. Certainly, this book had that effect on his life as a literary figure. But this is a story of Barchester Cathedral, which had a saintly old man as its guiding light, as the man in charge, and he dies. And rather than Archdeacon Grantley, his number one very forceful subordinate, getting that post, an outsider is put in. And his wife, his domineering wife, and also, for the purposes of the chapter that we're reading today, his oily, insinuating, power-mad private chaplain, Obadiah Slope, who's one of the villains of the piece. He's a weird figure. Trollope has a great deal of fun with some weird figures. He will always give us a figure like this and make them not entirely inhuman. There will be elements, there will be nuance to them, but they are always weird physically. Obadiah Slope is a weird specimen physically, and also thoroughly hateable. He is thoroughly hateable as a figure. We know him from Trollope's descriptions as power-hungry, venal, hypocritical, shallow. And the irony of the book is that this is technically a follow-up to an earlier book called The Warden. And in that book, there's a saintly old man who's in charge of a charitable hospital. And thanks to the terms of the will that established a charitable hospital, it turns out that he's making a lot of money every year for doing essentially nothing. And a ruckus rises about that whole subject in The Warden. And that gentle old man has two daughters. One is married to Archdeacon Grantley, and she is the mistress of Plumstead Episcopi, his manor house out in the country. And the other, Eleanor, she's beautiful and lovely and very Trollopian heroine. It's a long subject. We can go into it in another video. Trollope doesn't always make his heroines the most interesting women in his stories. Often there's another woman in the story who is far more interesting than either the heroine or any of the heroes. Eleanor Bold marries John Bold, the man who raises the ruckus in The Warden, and he dies. And he leaves her a wealthy widow with a little baby. So she's a wealthy, beautiful widow in Barchester. And that brings her to the attention of a few would-be suitors who don't care anything about her or her baby. They just want that money. They just want that money. Now, there's one of those suitors that we'll meet later on in this book. We've met him a few times before. But one of them is Obadiah Slope, who looks at the widow Bold and thinks, well, I don't care for people. I don't care for her. I'm not a gentle or a kind or a loving person myself, but that money would come in very handy. And as is the way with small towns, scuttlebutt starts to get around that maybe this is going to happen. Eleanor's father is horrified by the prospect. Slope is not a gentleman, which is Trollope's highest insult. He's a horrible churchman. He's vying for control of the diocese, of the parish, which makes him Dr. Grantley's enemy. No one likes him, and no one is anything but appalled at the idea that he might marry Eleanor Bold. And the tragedy of the book is that no one bothers to directly ask her about this. They just assume it. And she becomes gradually, very gradually, she becomes aware that they're assuming it. And it throws her, quite understandably, into a towering rage. She is staying out in the country at Plumstead Episcopi with her father and also with Mr. Arabin, an outsider who Dr. Grantley brings in to counter Mr. Slope. Gives him a small living at the parish of St. Ewald's. And expects him to do his duty entering the lists against Mr. Slope. Mr. Arabin is an attractive figure. Trollope likes him, and he means you to like him. And, of course, in the course of a month in a beautiful country house, he and Eleanor Bolt start to become fond of each other. They like talking to each other. They like even teasing each other. And also, Mr. Arabin is wonderful with her little boy. But among the many other aspects involved here that are getting everyone to think the wrong thing about what's going on is a letter. Obadiah Slope sends Eleanor Bolt a letter. It is not a good letter. It presumes a lot. It's overreaching, but she doesn't like that fact about the letter any more than anybody else does. Everyone else reads this letter. Gradually, everyone becomes aware of its contents, and they read this letter as her encouraging it. She was not. We know that as the reader. But somehow, every time it's brought up, when Dr. Grantley confronts her directly with it, every time it's brought up, somehow, all the characters present in those scenes manage not to actually say the truth, which is that Eleanor Bolt is just upset that everyone hates Mr. Slope. He seems not nice, not a gentleman certainly, but not anyone who should just be automatically hated and ostracized. That's all. That's as far as her feelings go. But she gets called on the carpet by Dr. Grantley. She gets called on the carpet by her own sister, and determines that she must leave Plumstead Episcopi. She must go back to Barchester. Obviously, if her host thinks that such horrible thoughts about her as that she would sully herself with Obadiah Slope, then she can't stay under his roof. She has to go back home. But before she does, we get a scene that people who have been reading this book all along have been waiting for. A confrontation not between her and Dr. Grantley, and not between her and her sister, but between her and Mr. Arabin. And that's what we get today. That's the chapter that we're up to now. This is chapter 30, called Another Love Scene. But there was another visitor at the rectory, whose feelings in this unfortunate manner must be strictly analyzed. Mr. Arabin had heard from his friend of the probability of Eleanor's marriage with Mr. Slope with amazement, but not with incredulity. It has been said that he was not in love with Eleanor, and up to this period this certainly had been true. But as soon as he heard that she loved someone else, he began to be very fond of her himself. He did not make up his mind that he wished to have her for his wife. He had never thought of her, nor did he now think of her, in connection with himself, but he experienced an inward, indefinable feeling of deep regret, a gnawing sorrow, an unconquerable depression of spirits, and also a species of self-abasement that he, Mr. Arabin, had not done something to prevent that other he, that vile he, whom he so thoroughly despised, from carrying off his sweet prize. Whatever man may have reached the age of 40, unmarried, without knowing something of such feelings, must have been very successful, or else very cold-hearted. Trollope's going to come back to that a couple of times. Imagine reaching the age of 40 without ever having known all these things. Like he was some great Lothario at the age of 40. But you have to put up with not only his casual sexism that she's a prize to be carried off with, but also this sententious moralizing from someone who was, to put it mildly, not exactly a ladies' man. Anyway, Mr. Arabin had never thought of trimming the sails of his bark so that he might sail as convoy to this rich argosy. He had seen that Mrs. Bold was beautiful, but he had not dreamt of making her beauty his own. He knew that Mrs. Bold was rich, but he had had no more idea of appropriating her wealth than that of Dr. Grantley. He had discovered that Mrs. Bold was intelligent, warm-hearted, agreeable, sensible, all, in fact, that a man could wish his wife to be. But the higher were her attractions, the greater her claims to consideration, the less had he imagined that he might possibly become the possessor of them. Such had been his instinct rather than his thoughts, so humble and so diffident. Now his diffidence was to be rewarded by seeing this woman, whose beauty was to his eyes perfect, whose wealth was such as to have deterred him from thinking of her, whose widowhood would have silenced him had he not been so deterred by his seeing her become the prey of Obadiah Slope. On the morning of Mrs. Bold's departure, he got on his horse to ride over to St. Ewolds. As he rode, he kept muttering to himself a line from Van Artevelde, and here we get Trollope quoting cod poetry, so we just skip over that. And so he went on, troubled much in his mind. He had but an uneasy ride of it that morning, and little good did he do at St. Ewolds. The necessary alterations in his house were being fast completed. Here we get what he did at St. Ewolds. It has a purpose. It has a callback purpose here. And he walked through the rooms and went up and down the stairs and rambled through the garden, but he could not wake himself to so much interest about them. He stood still at every window to look out and think upon Mr. Slope. At almost every window he had stood before and chatted with Eleanor. She and Mrs. Grantley had been there continually, and while Mrs. Grantley had been giving orders and seeing that orders were complied with, he and Eleanor had conversed on all things appertaining to a clergyman's profession. He thought how often he had laid down the law to her, and how sweetly she had borne with his somewhat dictatorial decrees. He remembered her listening intelligence, her gentle but quick replies, her interest in all that concerned the church, in all that concerned him. And then he struck his riding whip against the window-sill and declared to himself that it was impossible that Eleanor Bold should marry Mr. Slope. And it's a little bit tedious to hear about these house improvements, but that moment, imagining him out of sheer frustration striking his riding crop against the windowsill, that's pretty effective as a moment. And of course, me being me, I want to interject here. Far better that he used the riding crop on a windowsill than he used it on a helpless animal that he's using to travel from place to place. But anyway, and yet he did not really believe, as he should have done, that it was impossible. He should have known her well enough to feel that within her which would surely protect her from such a degradation, she would not do it. In other words, I read that wrong. But he, like so many others, was deficient in confidence in woman. Do tell, Tony. Yes, so many other people. Anyway, he said to himself over and over again that it was impossible that Eleanor Bold should become Mrs. Slope, and yet he believed that she would do so. And so he rambled about and could do and think of nothing. He was thoroughly uncomfortable, thoroughly ill at ease, cross with himself and everybody else, and feeding in his heart on animosity towards Mr. Slope. You're probably recognizing all of those symptoms, and Trollope doesn't let you wait. This was not as it should be, as he felt and knew, but he could not help himself. In truth, Mr. Arabin was now in love with Mrs. Bold, which explains all the rest. Though ignorant of that fact himself, he was in love, and though 40 years old, was in love without being aware of it. He fumed and fretted, and did not know what was the matter, as a youth might do at 21. And so, having done no good at St. Ewald's, he rode back much earlier than was usual with him, instigated by some inward unacknowledged hope that he might see Mrs. Bold before she left. And he's going to. Eleanor had not passed a pleasant morning. She was irritated with everyone, and not least with herself. She felt that she had been hardly used, but she also felt that she had not played her own cards well. She should have held herself so far above suspicion as to have received her sister's innuendos and the Archdeacon's lecture with indifference. She had not done this, but had shown herself angry and sore, and was now ashamed at her own petulance, and yet unable to discontinue it. In other words, she recognizes now that the angrier she got at their innuendos or their outright accusations, the more they would believe them. The greater part of the morning she had spent alone, but after a while her father joined her. He had fully made up his mind that, come what might, nothing should separate him from his younger daughter. It was a hard task for him to reconcile himself to the idea of seeing her at the head of Mr. Slope's table, but he got through it. Mr. Slope, as he argued to himself, was a respectable man and a clergyman, and he, as Eleanor's father, had no right even to endeavor to prevent her from marrying such a one. He longed to tell her how he had determined to prefer her to all the world, how he was prepared to admit that she was not wrong, how thoroughly he differed from Dr. Grantley, but he could not bring himself to mention Mr. Slope's name. There was yet a chance that they were all wrong in their surmise. They are all wrong in their surmise. It's so close yet so far. They can't talk about it. If they did, it would all clear up. Being thus in doubt, he could not bring himself to speak openly to her on the subject. He was sitting with her in the drawing room, with his arm around her waist, saying every now and then some little soft words of affection, and working hard with his imaginary fiddle bow. He has this weird habit of bowing on a fiddle, an imaginary fiddle, when he's feeling perturbed or whatnot. People must think he's crazy. When Mr. Arabin entered the room, he immediately got up, and the two made some trite remarks to each other, neither thinking of what he was saying, while Eleanor kept her seat on the sofa, mute and moody. Mr. Arabin was included in the list of those against whom her anger was excited. He, too, had dared to talk about her acquaintance with Mr. Slope. He, too, had dared to blame her for not making an enemy of his enemy. She had not intended to see him before her departure, and was now but little inclined to be gracious. In a situation like this, her father can't get out of the room fast enough, and he does. There was a feeling through the whole of the house that something was wrong. Mr. Arabin, when he saw Eleanor, could not succeed in looking or in speaking as though he knew nothing of all this. He could not be cheerful and positive and contradictory with her as was his wont. He had not been 2 minutes in the room before he felt that he had done wrong to return, and the moment he heard her voice, he thoroughly wished himself back at St. Ewolds. Why, indeed, should he have wished to have aught further to say to the future wife of Mr. Slope? Once these people get a wrong opinion in their head, they really hold on to. I am sorry to hear that you are to leave us soon, said he, striving in vain to use his ordinary voice. In answer to this, she muttered something about the necessity of her being in Barchester, and betook herself most industriously to her crochet work. Then there was a little more trite conversation between Mr. Arabin and Mr. Harding, trite and hard and vapid and senseless. Neither of them had anything to say to the other, and yet neither at such a moment liked to remain silent. At last Mr. Harding, taking advantage of a pause, escaped out of the room, and Eleanor and Mr. Arabin were left alone. Your going will be a great break-up to our party, said he. She again muttered something which was all but inaudible, but kept her eyes fixed upon her work. We have had a very pleasant month here, said he. At least I have, and I am very sorry it should so soon be over. I have already been from home longer than I intended, said she, and it is time that I should return. Well, pleasant hours and pleasant days must come to an end. It is a pity that so few of them are pleasant, or perhaps rather, it is a pity, certainly, that men and women do so much to destroy the pleasantness of their days, said she, interrupting him. It is a pity that there should be so little charity abroad. Charity should begin at home, said he, and he was proceeding to explain that he as a clergyman could not be what she would call charitable at the expense of those principles which he considered his duty to teach, when he remembered that it would be worse than vain to argue on such a matter with the future wife of Mr. Slope. But you are just leaving us, he continued, and I will not weary your last hour with another lecture. As it is, I fear I have given you too many. You should practice as well as preach, Mr. Arabin. Undoubtedly I should. So should we all. All of us who presume to teach are bound to do our utmost towards fulfilling our own lessons. I thoroughly allow my deficiency in doing so. But I do not quite know to what you now allude. Have you any special reason for telling me now that I should practice as well as preach? Eleanor made no answer. She longed to let him know the cause of her anger, to upbraid him for speaking of her disrespectfully, and then at last to forgive him, and so part friends. She felt that she would be unhappy to leave him in her present frame of mind, and yet she could hardly bring herself to speak of Mr. Slope. Why not? Why don't one of you do it? Just one. That's all it would take, is for one person to bring this up directly. And how could she allude to the innuendo thrown about by the Archdeacon, thrown out, as she believed, at the instigation of Mr. Arabin? She wanted to make him know that he was wrong, to make him aware that he had ill-treated her, in order that the sweetness of her forgiveness might be enhanced. She felt that she liked him too well to be contented to part with him in displeasure, and yet she could not get over her deep displeasure without some explanation, some acknowledgment on his part, some assurance that he would never again so sin against her. Why do you tell me that I should practice what I preach? Continued he. All men should do so. Certainly, that is, as it were, understood and acknowledged, but you do not say so to all men or to all clergymen. The advice, good as it is not given except as in allusion to some special deficiency. If you will tell me my special deficiency, I will endeavor to profit by the advice. She paused for a while, and then, looking full in his face, she said, You are not bold enough, Mr. Arabin, to speak out to me openly and plainly, and yet you expect me, a woman, to speak openly to you. Why do you speak calumny of me to Dr. Grantley behind my back? Calumny, said he, and his whole face became suffused with blood. What calumny? If I have spoken calumny of you, I beg your pardon, and his to whom I spoke it, and God's pardon also. But what calumny have I spoken of you to Dr. Grantley? She also blushed deeply. She could not bring herself to ask him whether he had not spoken of her as another man's wife. Why not? Good help us, it's on everybody's mind. Why can't any of you bring yourself to speak? You know that best yourself, said she. But I ask you as a man of honor, if you have not spoken of me as you would not have spoken of your own sister, or rather I will not ask you, she continued, finding that he did not immediately answer her, I will not put you to the necessity of answering such a question. Dr. Grantley has told me what you said. Dr. Grantley certainly asked me for my advice, and I gave it. He asked me, I know he did, Mr. Arabin. He asked you whether he would be doing right to receive me at Plumstead if I continued my acquaintance with a gentleman who happens to be personally disagreeable to yourself and to him. You are mistaken, Mrs. Bold. I have no personal knowledge of Mr. Slope. I never met him in my life. You are not the less individually hostile to him. It is not for me to question the propriety of your enmity, but I had a right to expect that my name should not have been mixed up in your hostilities. This has been done, and has been done by you in a manner most injurious and most distressing to me as a woman. I must confess, Mr. Arabin, that from you I expected a different sort of usage. When we're getting here, we had two scenes like this already in this book. Trollope is often praised for his letters, when he reproduces letters that characters are sending between each other. I want to put in a vote here for his one-on-one tete-a-tete. His face-to-face confrontation scenes like this are usually excellent. As she spoke, she with difficulty restrained her tears, but she did restrain them. Had she given way and sobbed aloud, as in such cases a woman should do, he would have melted at once, implored her pardon, perhaps knelt at her feet and declared his love. Everything would have been explained, and Eleanor would have gone back to Barchester with a contented mind. How easily would she have forgiven and forgotten the Archdeacon's suspicions had she but heard the whole truth from Mr. Arabin? She did not cry, and Mr. Arabin did not melt. Once again, we're coming a fraction of an inch away from this whole thing being resolved. You do me an injustice, said he. My advice was asked by Dr. Grantley, and I was obliged to give it. Dr. Grantley has been most officious, most impertinent. I have as complete a right to form my acquaintance as he is to form his. What would you have said had I consulted you as to the propriety of his banishing Dr. Grantley from my house because he knows Lord Tattenham Corner? I am sure Lord Tattenham is quite as objectionable an acquaintance for a clergyman as Mr. Slope is for a clergyman's daughter. I do not know Lord Tattenham Corner. Mr. Arabin, that is not the right response. She's made a perfectly good point. It doesn't matter that you don't know the man. But anyway, no, but Dr. Grantley does. It is nothing to me if he knows all the young lords at every race course in England. I shall not interfere with him. He shall with me, nor shall he with me. In other words, she's telling Mr. Arabin, I object to you people policing who I know, or insisting that I hate the people you hate. That's all. No thought of marriage. Nothing like that. I'm sorry to differ with you, Mrs. Bold, but as you have spoken to me on this matter, and especially as you blame me for what little I said on the subject, I must tell you that I do differ from you. Dr. Grantley's position as a man in the world gives him a right to choose his own acquaintances, subject to certain influences. If he chooses them badly, those influences will be used. If he consorts with persons unsuitable to him, his bishop will interfere. What the bishop is to Dr. Grantley is to you. I deny it. I deny it utterly, said Eleanor, jumping from her seat and literally flashing before Mr. Arabin as she stood on the drawing-room floor. He had never seen her so excited. He had never seen her look half so beautiful. I utterly deny it, said she. Dr. Grantley has no sort of jurisdiction over me whatsoever. Do you forget that I am not altogether alone in the world? Do you forget that I have a father? Dr. Grantley, I believe, always has forgotten it. That line, what the bishop is to Dr. Grantley is to you. Oh, no. Eleanor Bold may not be the most fire and brimstone of the wonderful women that Trollope creates on his pages, but she's not going to sit still for that. Who would, for Pete's sake? There isn't a woman in this book who would sit still for that, not even Mrs. Grantley. Anyway, from you, Mr. Arabin, she continued, I would have listened to advice, because I should have expected it to have been given as one friend may advise another, not as a schoolmaster gives an order to a pupil. I might have differed from you. On this matter, I should have done so. But had you spoken to me in your usual manner, and with your usual freedom, I should not have been so angry. But now, was it manly of you, Mr. Arabin, to speak of me in this way? So disrespectful? So... I cannot bring myself to repeat what you said. You must understand what I feel. Was it just of you to speak of me in such a way? To advise my sister's husband to turn me out of my sister's house because I choose to know a man whose doctrine you disapprove? I have no alternative left to me, Mrs. Bold, he said, standing with his back to the fireplace, looking down intently at the carpet pattern, and speaking with a slow, measured voice, but to tell you plainly what did take place between me and Dr. Grantley. Well, said she, finding that he paused a moment. He's not even looking at her. He doesn't have the courage to look at her. He's looking at the carpet. I'm afraid that what I say may pain you. It cannot well do so more than you have already done, said she. Dr. Grantley asked me whether I thought it would be prudent for him to receive you in his house as the wife of Mr. Slope, and I told him that I thought it would be imprudent. Believing it to be utterly impossible that Mr. Slope and Thank you, Mr. Arabin, that is sufficient. I do not want to know your reasons, she said, speaking in a terribly calm voice. I have shown to this gentleman the commonplace civility of a neighbor, and because I have done so, because I have not indulged against him in all the rancor and hatred which you and Dr. Grantley consider due to clergymen who you do not agree with yourself, you conclude that I am to marry him, or rather you do not conclude so. No rational man could really come to such an outrageous conclusion without better ground. You have not thought so. But as I am in a position in which such an accusation might be peculiarly painful, it is made in order that I may be terrified into hostility against this enemy of yours. She's not even willing to grant that they believe it. She thinks it's just a means of controlling her. As she finished speaking, she walked to the drawing room window and stepped out into the garden. Those of you Americans, she's not climbing through a window. It's a door sized. It's called a window, but she's not climbing through a window. She's walking through a garden door. Mr. Arabin was left in the room, still occupied in counting the pattern on the carpet. He had, however, distinctly heard and accurately marked every word that she had spoken. Was it not clear from what she had said that the Archdeacon had been wrong in imputing to her any attachment to Mr. Slope? Yes, it is clear that that was wrong. Was it not clear that Eleanor was still free to make another choice? It may seem strange that he should for a moment have had a doubt, and yet he did doubt. She had not absolutely denied the charge. She had not expressly said it was untrue. Mr. Arabin understood little of the nature of a woman's feelings, or he would have known how improbable it was that she would make any clearer declaration than she had done. Few men do understand the nature of a woman's heart till years have robbed such understanding of its value. And it is well that it should be so, or men should triumph too easily. Is that true, Tony? Well, none of us are there in the house with you to hear the tirades your wife reads to you, with you meekly standing there counting the pattern in the carpet yourself. You all-conquering Lothario. God help us. Mr. Arabin stood counting the carpet, unhappy, wretchedly unhappy, at the hard words that had been spoken to him, and yet happy, exquisitely happy, as he thought that after all the woman whom he regarded was not to become the wife of the man he so much disliked. As he stood there, he began to be aware that he himself was in love. 40 years had passed over his head, and yet as yet no woman's beauty had given him an uneasy hour. His present hour was very uneasy. Not that he remained there for half an hour or a quarter of that time. In spite of what Eleanor had said, Mr. Arabin was in truth a manly man. Having ascertained that he loved this woman, and having now reason to believe that she was free to receive his love, at least if she pleased to do so, he followed her into the garden to make such wooing as he could. He had not long in finding her. She was walking to and fro beneath the avenue of elms that stood in the Archdeacon's grounds, skirting the churchyard. What had passed between her and Mr. Arabin had not, alas, tended to lessen the acerbity of her spirit. She was very angry, more angry with him than with anyone. How could he have so misunderstood her? She had been so intimate with him, had allowed him such latitude in what he had chosen to say to her, had complied with his ideas, cherished his views, fostered his precepts, cared for his comforts, made much of him in every way which a pretty woman can make much of an unmarried man without committing herself or her feelings. She had been doing this, and while she had been doing it, he had regarded her as the affianced wife of another man. As she passed along the avenue, every now and then an unbidden tear would force itself upon her cheek, and as she raised her hand to brush it away, she stamped her little foot upon the sward with very spite to think that she had been so treated. Mr. Arabin was very near to her when she first saw him, and she turned short around and retraced her steps down the avenue, trying to rid her cheeks of all trace of the telltale tears. It was a needless endeavor, for Mr. Arabin was in a state of mind that hardly allowed him to observe such trifles. He followed her down the walk and overtook her just as she reached the end of it. He had not considered how he would address her. He had not thought what he would say. He only felt that it was wretchedness to him to quarrel with her, and it would be happiness to be allowed to love her. And yet he could not lower himself by asking her pardon. He had done to her no wrong. He had not calumniated her and had not injured her, and he had accused, as she had accused him of doing. He could not confess of sins which he had not been guilty. He could only let the past be past and ask her as to her hopes for the future. It's not exactly true. It's hair-splitting. When Dr. Grantley said, well, when she's Obadiah Slope's wife, should I admit her into my house? Mr. Arabin should have said, it's foul of you to impute that she would ever be that man's wife. And even if she is, it would be foul and unchristian of you to bar her from your house. He didn't say either of those things. He said the opposite. I hope we are not to part as enemies, said he. There shall be no enmity on my part, said Eleanor. I endeavor to avoid all enmities. It would be a hollow pretense were I to say that there can be true friendship between us after what has passed. People cannot make friends of those whom they despise. And am I despised? I must have been so before you could have spoken of me as you did. And I was deceived, cruelly deceived. I believed that you thought well of me. I believed that you esteemed me. Thought well of you and esteemed you? In justifying myself before you, I must use stronger words than those. He paused for a moment, and Eleanor's heart beat with painful violence within her bosom as she waited for him to go on. I have esteemed, do esteem you, as I never yet esteemed any woman. Think well of you. I never thought to think so well, so much of any human creature. Speak calumny of you, insult you, willfully injure you. I wish it were my privilege to shield you from calumny, insult, and injury. Calumny? Ah, me! 'Twere almost better that it were so. Better than to worship with a sinful worship, sinful and vain also. And then, as he walked along beside her with his hands clasped behind his back, looking down on the grass beneath his feet and utterly at a loss how to explain his meaning, and Eleanor walked beside him, determined at least to give him no assistance. Might help if you looked her in the face just once, Smedley. Ah me, he uttered at last, speaking rather to himself than to her. Ah me, these Plumstead walks were pleasant enough if one could have but heart's ease, but without that the dull, dead stones of Oxford were far preferable, and St. Ewald's too. Mrs. Bold, I am beginning to think that I mistook myself when I came hither. A Romish priest, in other words, Catholic, would now have escaped all of this. O Father of Heaven, how good of us would it be if thou couldst vouchsafe to us a certain rule. Here, Mr. Arabin is referring to the fact that a Catholic priest cannot woo and cannot wed. And have we not a certain rule, Mr. Arabin? Yes, surely. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. But what is temptation? What is evil? Is this evil? Is this temptation? Poor Mr. Arabin. It would not come out of him. There's no better way to put it than that. It would not come out of him. That deep, true love of his. He could not bring himself to utter it in plain language that would require and demand an answer. He knew not how to say to the woman by his side, since the fact is that you do not love that other man, that you are not to be his wife, can you love me? Will you be my wife? These were the words which were in his heart, but with all his sighs he could not draw them to his lips. He would have given anything, everything, for the power to ask that simple question, but glib as his tongue was in pulpits or on platforms, now he could not find the words wherewith to express the plain wish of his heart. And yet Eleanor understood him as thoroughly as though he had declared his passion with all the elegant fluency of a practiced Lothario. With a woman's instinct, she followed every bend of his mind. As he spoke the pleasantries of Plumstead and the stones of Oxford, as he alluded to the safety of the Romish priest and the hidden perils of temptation, she knew that it all meant love. She knew that this man at her side, this accomplished scholar, this practiced orator, this great polemical combatant, was striving and striving in vain to tell her that his heart was no longer his own. She knew this and felt a joy in knowing it, and yet she would not come to his aid. He had offended her deeply and treated her unworthily, the more unworthily seeing as he had learnt to love her, and Eleanor could not bring herself to abandon her revenge. She did not ask herself whether or not she would ultimately accept his love. She did not even acknowledge to herself that she now perceived it with pleasure. At the present moment it did not touch her heart. It merely appeased her pride and flattered her vanity. Mr. Arabin had dared to associate her name with that of Mr. Slope, and now her spirit was soothed by finding that he would fain associate it with his own. And so she walked on beside him, inhaling incense but giving out no sweetness in return. When, again, that would fix everything. Or if Mr. Arabin had found the courage to say that one sentence, that would have fixed everything. Answer me this, said Mr. Arabin, stopping suddenly in his walk and stepping forward so that he faced his companion. About time. Answer me this one question. You do not love Mr. Slope? You do not intend to be his wife? Of all the things that you could ask at this moment. Oh, the very worst. It's the very worst thing he could have said. Mr. Arabin certainly, Mr. Arabin certainly did not go the right way to win such a woman as Eleanor Bolt. Just as her wrath was evaporating, as it was disappearing before the true warmth of his untold love, he rekindled it by a most useless repetition of his original sin. Had he known what he was about, he would never have mentioned Mr. Slope's name before Eleanor Bolt till he had made her all his own. Then, and not till then, he might have talked of Mr. Slope with such triumph as he chose. I shall answer no such questions, said Eleanor. And what is more, I must tell you that nothing can justify your asking it. Good morning. And so saying, she stepped proudly across the lawn, and passing through the drawing room window, joined her father and sister at lunch in the dining room. Half an hour afterwards, she was in the carriage, and so she left Plumstead without again seeing Mr. Arabin. His walk was long and sad among the sombre trees that overshadowed the courtyard. He left the Archdeacon's grounds that he might escape attention, and sauntered among the green hillocks under which lay at rest so many of the once loving swains and forgotten beauties of Plumstead. It's a neat little moment there. Not supposed to dwell on it all that much. But Trollope is alluding to the fact that in just a moment he takes you 30,000 years out of his story to the fact that these contretemps, these love affairs, misunderstandings, all of those swains and beauties had them. They're long buried. They're long buried under the grass at Plumstead. And then you get plunged right back in. But it's a wonderful Trollope thing. He doesn't do it that often. To his ears, Eleanor's last words sounded like a knell never to be reversed. He could not comprehend that she might be angry with him, indignant with him, remorseless with him, and yet love him. He could not make up his mind whether or no Mr. Slope was in truth a favourite rival. If not, why should she not have answered his question? Poor Mr. Arabin, untaught, illiterate, boorish, ignorant man, that at 40 years of age you should know so little of the workings of a woman's heart. Now, I might joke about Trollope taking such a sententious tone, but nevertheless, at that moment every reader is groaning, male or female. They're all groaning. That he should be so clueless as to be wondering, well, if it's not true, why didn't she answer the question? to have so little understanding of human nature that that's what he's wondering when she storms off. But anyway, that is chapter 30 of Barchester Towers. And we're going to move on next time to chapter 31, which is called The Bishop's Library. And what we saw in this chapter is just the continuation of this pattern, especially at Plumstead Episcopi, where if people would just directly talk about this subject, it would be cleared up in an instant. Maybe not in an instant, maybe not, because we're told that Eleanor is relishing her revenge. She won't give up on her anger, on her petulance. It'd probably take her a bit of time to give up on those things. They're very sweet emotions. They're bad for you, but they're very addictive. But nevertheless, it would happen. But not in this chapter. This is the last chance that we got. She is leaving Plumstead Episcopi, with everyone present either believing that she does intend to become the wife of Obadiah Slope, or in the case of Mr. Arabin, not knowing whether or not it's true, when there should be no doubt whatsoever. But anyway, that's chapter 30. I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.